guys, I have never been more excited to share a pattern with you than this pattern. Evan and I have worked so hard and so long to get a perfect fit. We've tested it on tons of different bodies with different bust cup sizes, and I really truly believe that this is one of our best patterns yet, if not actually our best pattern yet. I really love the structure, the silhouette, the way it fits, and also how easy it is to pair with other things in your closet. Not to mention, there's also a dress version, so if you don't want to fuff around with finding pants to wear with it or what have you, you can totally just sew the dress and it stands all on its own. I quickly want to talk about a few considerations that you're going to want to think through before we get into this tutorial. Okay, so I have two different top versions here. One is made out of a denim material and the other is made out of a cotton. The cotton is obviously significantly more lightweight, and so when you're working with a lightweight fabric like this, you can actually line the entire inside of the garment with the same fabric that's on the outside. For this specific sample, I was using leftover fabric scraps from a different project, so I actually didn't have enough to completely line it in the same fabric. So if I open it up, you'll notice that there's a different fabric in here, but this top piece is like this. And then if I flip it around so you can see the inside, this top piece is the same as the outer. And the reason I did that is because I'll actually show you with this one. It's lined with white. And so if I flip it out, you'll notice that it's obviously a different color and it's kind of visible, like just a tiny bit up here. This is one of the earlier samples that we made. So in the instructions, you'll notice that this upper bust panel, we say cut 2 of the outer fabric, and one of those actually does get used for the lining. But again, if you are using a lightweight fabric, you can use the same fabric for the complete outer shell and the complete inner shell. So this denim sample, you will see the exact same thing. If I open up the zipper and we take a look on the inside, we've got the denim up here and the lower shell being in a cotton. And the reason that I did separate lining and outer pieces is because the denim is really thick. So especially when you get to binding the bottom edge here, it can be really thick and hard on your machine if the inside and the outside of the garment is completely the same fabric. So if you're going to use a thicker fabric like denim, I highly recommend only doing this upper lining piece as the same fabric and everything else in something lightweight like a cotton. Another thing to take into consideration if you're using a fabric that's really heavyweight is that these straps here are going to be difficult to turn inside out. So on this cotton version, you basically like sew a tube and then you're going to turn it right sides out. But with this denim version, instead, I sewed it in thirds. So I serged one edge, I sewed it in thirds, and then I top stitched it the same way that you would do a belt loop. This way you don't have to take a tube and turn it inside out and have like such thick fabric on the inside. It can just be really difficult. But when you do it like this, because of the width of the strap, these strap adjusters need to be a different size. And this is in the instructions, but I did want to note it here. If you're using a thick fabric and you're folding it in thirds like this, instead of turning the tube, you're gonna want 1/2 inch strap adjusters, whereas this one is smaller. And since we're talking about adjusters, I wanted to point out these ones that I just purchased on Amazon. These are metal adjusters, which in my opinion are way better than the plastic ones. I've been using plastic ones on my other samples and these just feel a lot more cheap. And I know that the metal ones are gonna be more durable over time. I also like the way that they look more. So anyways, I'll have that link down below if it's something that you're interested in. These plasticky ones I picked up from Joann's, and the one on Amazon is a way better bang for your buck. And again, like I said, it's just higher quality. You get so many of these for like $10 or something like that. I think there's maybe 150 or 200 different adjuster sets. So something to keep in mind as you are preparing to sew this project. You'll also notice that in this sample, I have an invisible zipper. And in this sample, it's not an invisible zipper. I actually just did this one because I liked the way that the hardware here matched with the hardware here. So that's the only reason I didn't do an invisible zipper. However, the actual pattern does call for an invisible zipper. You're going to use the same length zipper for the top and for the dress version, because when we sew the top version, we're actually going to snip off the bottom of the zipper that we don't need. We're gonna get into that in the tutorial. I'm gonna go through how to sew a top and how to sew a dress, so you can kind of just divert to whichever one you're planning to sew. A lot of the construction for the two views is the same. However, the closure system for the top is different than the closure system for the dress. So once we get to that section, we'll kind of, separate ways in the tutorial, and I'll have timestamps so you can skip ahead if you're, not making the top and you're making the dress, or vice versa. These are the two fabrics that I'm planning to use. This fabric here is a little bit more heavy than this fabric. This one is just a quilting cotton. I'm going to use it for the dress version, and I'm going to line the inside with the same fabric. But because this fabric is thicker, I'm going to line this top with this fabric. One thing to note is that if you're using a fabric with a directional print and you're sewing the dress version, the skirt section is cut on the cross grain because it's so wide that it needs to be cut on the cross grain in order to fit on standard widths of fabric. So if the print that's on your fabric needs to be in a specific direction, you might have to take the skirt panel and cut it in half in order for everything to fit. Again, that's only going to be something that's important if you're using a fabric with a directional print. I'm using this fabric for the dress, so I'm not going to have any issues cutting out the skirt. And then we just have our zippers over here, and we're ready to get into it. One last thing that I want to note before we get into cutting our fabric is that the pattern pieces are very easy to get mixed up. There's a picture inside the instructions that shows exactly how everything is supposed to be laid out and sewn together, so keep that handy as you're going through the sewing process. If you're a projector sewist like I am, I highly recommend that you print out the paper pattern pieces for the bodice so that you can keep them handy with your fabric as you're sewing. That way you won't get any of the pattern pieces confused and you won't sew them together in the wrong order or the wrong orientation. What I'm going to be doing is using the paper pattern pieces for the bodice and then projecting the skirt pattern piece for the dress version. You'll also notice that I cut out the center front panel on the cross grain, and that's really just because I wanted the design detail of having the stripes in the opposite direction as the rest of the garment. Now, like I said, because I'm a projector sewist, I'm actually going to be projecting the skirt onto the fabric rather than using paper pattern pieces. If you have a projector as well, this is a really great option. Because the pattern pieces are so large, it's a lot more efficient and economical to be using a projector rather than printing out all of that paper. If you don't really know anything about projector sewing, but you're interested in learning more, I do have a blog post that I'll link down below for you, which is a great resource that also has a ton of other resources inside there so that you can learn more and see if it's a good fit for you. Now, if you're using a lightweight fabric like I am, you could consider using fusible interfacing to line the bodice. If you do use interfacing, I highly recommend a lightweight or midweight picot interfacing rather than a heavyweight interfacing. I accidentally used a heavyweight interfacing for this garment, and I just didn't love the way that it felt and moved with my body, so like I said, I just recommend using something that's more lightweight. One other thing to note that's really important is that you cut your interfacing with your pattern pieces rather than with your fabric. That way you won't accidentally distort the shape of your pattern pieces. Now, once everything's cut out, it's actually time to use the interfacing. So what you're going to do is you're going to place your rough glue side facing the wrong side of the fabric. And then with a low heat setting, you're going to press and hold the iron over every section of the interfacing for at least 10 to 15 seconds each. Normally I start with one quick pass and then I go back and hold each section. If you don't iron each section for long enough, the glue won't properly adhere and it might peel away from the fabric over time. I've had this happen to garments that I've made in the past and it's pretty visible, so I highly recommend just doing your due diligence while you're interfacing. Now that all the pattern pieces are cut out and fully prepped, it's time to start constructing the bodice and the lining. Like I said before, it's really easy to confuse the bodice pattern pieces and their orientation, so I highly recommend keeping those paper pattern pieces with the fabric as you go along. We're going to start by placing both side front panel pieces on top of the center front panel. Then we're going to pin them together from top to bottom. Once you've pinned one side, you can move the fabric out of the way, place the other one down, and then pin again all the way from the top to the bottom. Then we're going to take our fabric to our sewing machine and sew the sides together with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure that the front side panel that you're not actively sewing is folded open so that you don't accidentally sandwich it in between the stitches. Now once that's all sewn together, here's what those pattern pieces are going to look like. You want to close them up and we are going to take our scissors and snip into the seam allowance about every 1/2 inch. You want to snip as close as you can get to the seam allowance without actually snipping through it, and doing this step is going to make the next step a lot easier, which is bringing your fabric over to your ironing board and ironing those seam allowances open. If you don't snip into the seam allowance, it can be really difficult to get a nice, crisp, open seam allowance. If you have a pressing ham handy, I highly recommend using it because it's a really great tool when you're trying to iron open seam allowances that are curvy. Now we're going to place the front upper bust pattern piece on top of the front bodice with right sides together. Make sure to line up those notches with the princess seams and that the lower bodice is correctly oriented. Once you've done that, you're going to pin all the way along the edges. I like to pin the notches first, and then you can pin the outsides and everything else in between. That way you ensure that the fabric is evenly distributed. Now we're going to take our work back to our sewing machine and sew that seam together with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now once again, we're going to take our scissors and clip into the seam allowance as close as we can get to the seam without cutting through it. You'll do this every 1/2 inch or so, all the way from end to end. Then we'll take our work back to our ironing board and iron that seam allowance open. It can be a little bit difficult to do this seam just because the bust point is exactly that, it's pretty pointy. So if you don't have a pressing ham for this step, I highly recommend finding something similar to a pressing ham. You could even maybe grab a pillow, but you essentially just want a nice rounded edge to be pressing on top of. I personally love this step of the process because you really get to see the garment come to life and how structural and nice it's going to lay on the body. After you admire your beautiful work, go ahead and set this piece aside. Now let's go ahead and grab our back middle panels and back side panels. We're going to place them together with right sides facing each other, being sure to line up the notches. Then, just like with all the other steps so far, we're going to pin them together and we're going to sew them together with a 3/8 inch or a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Here's what those pattern pieces should be looking like once they're sewn together. Now we're going to take our scissors and clip into the seam allowance every 1/2 inch. Once that's done on both sides, go ahead and take your work over to your ironing station and press those seam allowances open. Now we can go ahead and grab the front bodice that we prepared earlier, and we're going to attach the back pieces to the front pieces at the side seams. Make sure that you're joining the correct pieces together before doing this. You'll just align the notches and then you'll pin them together. To clarify, you're going to be pinning pattern piece D, which is the back side panel, to the side seams of that front bodice that you prepared. Pattern piece E is the back middle panel, and that's going to be joined together at the center back with an invisible zipper later on. Here's how those pieces should be looking when they're opened up. Now we're going to close them and sew them together with a 3/8 inch or a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm willing to bet you can guess what's next. We are going to snip into that seam allowance every 1/2 inch or so all the way up, and then we're going to bring that work back to our ironing station and we're going to press the seam allowance open. At this point, you have a fully constructed bodice. Make sure that you've done the outer and the lining as well. I did the lining off camera just because it's literally the exact same steps. And now we are going to take those two pieces and make them one. After sewing the step that I'm showing right now, I realized that I accidentally skipped a step. I was supposed to prepare the straps and the strap loops before sewing these two panels together, but I forgot and I realized after I sewed these together, so I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do the straps and the strap loops, and then we'll come back to pinning and sewing these pieces together. So when making the strap loops, you have a few different options depending on the type of fabric that you're using. If you're using a heavyweight fabric like denim, you're going to want to take the straps and the strap loops and fold them the same way that you would fold and press bias tape and then top stitch them together. We're going to use the exact same method for the waist binding of the top later on, so if you've never sewn bias tape and you're using a heavyweight fabric, go ahead and skip to that section right now. However, if you have a lightweight fabric like I do, you're going to fold the straps in half lengthwise with right sides together, and then we're going to pin them all the way down and sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you're going to do that for both the straps and the strap loops. Once those pieces are all sewn together, we're going to use a loop turner to turn the pieces inside out. This can be a little bit tricky, especially if you've never used a loop turner before. They're kind of just fiddly in the first place because the clamp that holds onto the fabric as you turn it inside out isn't very strong. So just ensure that when you're doing this, you're being really, really careful and give yourself grace through this process if it doesn't work the very first time. Like I said, it's a little bit fiddly, but I believe in you. You can absolutely do it. After the straps are fully turned, we're going to take them over to the ironing station and iron them so that they're nice and crispy and flat. The seam allowance on the inside of the strap has been designed to fully take up the width of the inside of the strap. This will make pressing easier, and in my opinion, it makes the strap feel a lot more sturdy. After pressing, we're going to insert the strap loops into our O-rings. Remember that if you're using thick fabric, you're going to want 1/2 inch O-rings, and if you're using thin fabric, you're going to want 3/8 inch O-rings. The reason is because, again, the construction of the strap and strap loops is a little bit different depending on the thickness of your fabric, and so they have a little bit of different needs. Now, after you've inserted your strap loop into the O-ring, you're going to fold the strap loop in half so that the raw edges meet each other. I like to stick a pin in it at this point just so that everything stays nice and tidy and together and the O-ring doesn't fall out. Then we're going to take both of those pieces over to our sewing machine and we are going to edge stitch the raw edges together. Sometimes when you sew pieces like this together, the feed dogs on the bottom of the machine don't want to pull the fabric through, so you kind of have to help it along. I also recommend starting with the needle in the down position in the very middle of the strap, and then just go back and forth a few times to secure the strap loops in place. Once those strap loops are all prepared, we're going to place them at the top of the back princess seam lines. We're going to sandwich them in between the bodice lining and the top of the bodice outer with right sides together. But you'll notice that I accidentally sewed these panels together already, which is why I told you earlier that I made a mistake and had to move forward with it. So this is me unpicking where the strap loops need to go, and then I'm just going to sew right over it. When we sew this section together, we are only going to sew from the center back to the neckline edge. That way the neckline edge is still open and we can insert the straps into it in the next step. After sewing the outer and the lining together with the strap loops sandwiched in between, we are going to snip into the seam allowance only on the section that we sewed, which was from the center back to the neckline edge, and you just want to make sure again that you are not clipping past the seam allowance. Go ahead and do that on both sides, and then we're going to grab the straps that we prepared earlier and we are going to sandwich them in between the neckline. When we do this, we're going to insert the straps at an angle between the bodice lining and the bodice outer. You want the strap to butt up against the seam line that you just sewed. This is going to ensure that the strap point comes out really nice when you flip the straps to the outside of the garment. Then we're going to keep pinning along the neckline, bring our work back to our sewing machine, and sew the neckline together with the 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now for the very last time, we are going to snip into the seam allowance every 1/2 inch or so, making sure to not cut past the seam line. Now we're going to turn the garment right sides out and press along the entire top edge of the bodice. If you'd like to, you can also optionally understitch the seam allowance to the lining along the top edge of the back bodice and neckline. Doing this will just further help ensure that the lining stays on the back side of the garment. Okay, at this point, we are going to continue sewing the top, but if you are sewing the dress version, go ahead and skip to the timestamp that's on the screen. So moving forward with the top, go ahead and open your invisible zipper and bring it over to your ironing station. With the low heat setting, we are going to iron open the invisible zipper teeth on both sides. This is going to make it a lot easier when we get to the sewing section, because if you don't iron open the teeth, it can make it so that the invisible zipper isn't actually invisible, because it's really hard to get close enough to the teeth with your sewing machine if the teeth aren't ironed flat. Now go ahead and take your bodice and open it up so that the lining is out of the way. Then grab your invisible zipper and line up the beginning of the zipper teeth just below the seam where the bodice and the outer lining attach. You'll notice that the zipper tape extends onto the lining side, but that's totally okay. We're going to snip it off in a later step, so don't worry about it. You're going to pin all the way from the top of the zipper teeth down to the bottom of the bodice. When you pin that top bit, I recommend moving the seam allowance out of the way so that it doesn't get caught in the stitching. Now we're going to sew the zipper in place, and when we do this, we want to get as close to the zipper teeth as possible without actually puncturing through them. There are 2 secrets to doing this. One is to use an invisible zipper foot, and the other is the step that we already did, which was pressing the zipper teeth open. Now you're going to sew from the top of the zipper teeth to the bottom of the outer bodice. The goal is to stitch on top of the visible line that's left over from where the zipper teeth was creased before you pressed it open. Now we're going to snip off the excess zipper fabric that's just above the zipper teeth. I like to put my scissors right in line with the seam where the outer bodice and the lining meet, and then snip right there. Now we're going to encapsulate the zipper between the bodice lining and the outer bodice. So with right sides together, you're going to fold the bodice lining over the outer bodice and pin it in place. Then we're going to sew this section in place, but when we do this, we need to make sure that we do not sew through the zipper teeth. So my preference is to pin this all together and then actually sew from the opposite side so you can see those original stitches, and then you're just going to stitch right on top of them. That way you will know for sure that you are not going to sew through the zipper teeth. Now we're going to do all those exact same steps with the zipper on the other side of the bodice. So start by turning the garment right sides out, and then with right sides together, pull the zipper all the way over. Line up the top of the zipper teeth with the top of the bodice, being sure not to pin the lining or the seam allowance. Then go ahead and open the zipper, move the lining out of the way, and pin the zipper all the way down to the bottom of the bodice. Once that's done, bring your work back to your sewing machine and sew the zipper in place as close as you can get to those zipper teeth without sewing through them. Now snip off the excess zipper fabric that's above the zipper teeth. Be careful not to cut through any of your stitching or your fabric. Then fold your lining over your bodice with right sides facing each other, pin all the way down the edge, and then sew them together. Again, I prefer sewing directly on top of the original stitches that are holding the zipper in place on the outer bodice. Okay, big congratulations on sewing in your invisible zipper. Now all you need to do is turn the garment right sides out and then zip the zipper up, and your zipper is officially finished. The next step is to snip off the excess zipper that extends beyond the bottom edge of the top. Be sure that after you snip this off, you do not unzip the zipper. If you unzip the zipper, it'll break and you won't be able to get the zipper pulled back on. Okay, we are officially at the very last few steps of this top. We are going to prepare the waist binding, and then we are going to attach the waist binding. So to do this, take your waist binding and fold and press it just like you would with bias tape. So to start out, we're going to fold and press the binding in half lengthwise. Then after that, we are going to fold and press the outer edges in half so that the raw edges meet in the middle at that first crease. So while this pattern piece isn't technically cut on the bias, it is going to act like bias tape. So we're essentially just going to bias bind the entire bottom edge of the top. I like to start and stop my waist binding in line with one of the side seams. In order to do this, we need at least 1/2 inch of extra tail extending beyond the side seam. Then we're just going to continue pinning all the way around the top until we come full circle. You'll notice that I already have some pins in the bottom of the top. I did this to ensure that the lining and the outer shell were even all the way around. Now to sew the binding on, we are going to use a 3/8 inch or a 1 centimeter seam allowance. You're going to start your stitches at whatever vertical seam you originally chose when you were pinning the waist binding on. Then you're going to sew all the way around. Please note that you will be sewing over the zipper teeth of the invisible zipper. So to ensure that you don't break a needle, use the hand crank on your machine to stitch over the zipper teeth. Then continue sewing until you get all the way back to the start. If you have any excess tail, you can go ahead and snip it off. Then fold the tail at the beginning of the binding towards the start of your stitches. Continue sewing the binding down over the starting point by 1/2 inch. To help reduce bulk for the next step, we're going to trim off even more of that excess tail until you get to the end of your stitches. Then, using the creases from earlier as a guide, fold the binding so that the raw edge of the binding meets the raw edge of the bodice. then fold it again so that the seam allowance is fully enclosed, and the last fold overlaps the stitch line by about 1/8 of an inch, or 0.3 centimeters. We're going to do this all the way around the binding and pin it in place so that it's easier to sew in the next step. Now to finish it all off, you have two options. You can either stitch in the ditch or edge stitch the binding in place from the front side of the garment, being sure to catch the back side of the waist binding. Stitching in the ditch can be more difficult, but it gives a really beautiful and clean result because it essentially makes the stitch line invisible. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. If you're stitching in the ditch, the goal is for the stitching to be invisible from the right side of the garment, but still stitch down the inner binding all the way around. I highly recommend going slow for this section because it's really easy to stitch outside of the ditch. And if you do that, the stitches will just be visible. Now when you get to the zipper, be sure to use the hand wheel on your sewing machine so that you don't accidentally break a needle. This is going to be the exact same process as before. Now that the binding is attached, here's what it should look like from the outside as well as from the inside. Now the last step is to finish off those straps, so go ahead and start by grabbing your strap sliders. You're going to thread the strap through the strap slider on both sides. Next, take the end of the strap and slide it through the O-ring. This last bit can be a little bit tricky, but you've got it. We're going to take the end of the strap and slide it back through the back side of the slider. I feel like this step is a little bit easier to watch than to explain, so keep a close eye on what I'm doing, and you can also check out the illustrations and the instructions that are in the instruction booklet. Lastly, we're going to pin and sew the strap to itself using a straight stitch. Make sure that you sew the end to the correct side, because if you sew it to the wrong side, the strap isn't going to adjust properly. So with that in mind, go ahead and ensure that the strap is adjusting properly with the pin in it before you sew it down. Now when you get over to your sewing machine, simply sew the end of the strap in place. I like to sew back and forth a few times just to ensure that it's nice and sturdy. If you're following along with the sparkle top version, congratulations, you are officially finished. Your sparkle top looks amazing, and I hope you love it. Now if you're sewing the sparkle dress, let's go ahead and get started. This is the bodice of the dress that I sewed off camera because the steps are the exact same for the top and for the dress. Make sure you have your skirt pattern pieces cut out, and let's go ahead and start constructing the skirt. Okay, I love a good top-down shot, but it's not gonna work for these pattern pieces for the skirt because the skirt is just so big and voluminous. It takes up literally my entire table, and so I can't get a shot that's like big enough to see everything. So we're gonna have to work with what we got going on, but I think it'll be totally fine. Basically what we're gonna do is take one of the skirt pattern pieces and cut it straight down the center back. That's where we're gonna insert the zipper on the back side of the dress. So basically I'm just gonna fold it in half, make a nice crease, and then cut along that crease. After cutting the back skirt panel down the center back, we are going to sew the front skirt panels to the back skirt panels at the side seams. When you do this, make sure that the right sides of the fabric are facing each other, then pin all the way up the side of the skirt panel. Next, we're going to take our work over to our sewing machine and sew the side seams together with a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once you've done this to both sides, we're going to finish the side seams together and finish the center back edges. You can use a serger or a zigzag stitch depending on what's available to you. Then after that, we're going to press the seam allowances of the side seams towards the center back. Okay, our skirt pattern pieces are all prepped. I know it's a lot of fabric to keep track of, so it's kind of hard to see all of it on camera. We've sewn the side seams together and we've finished the edges together either with a zigzag stitch or a serger stitch. And then we've also finished the edges of the center back on both sides. These big panels are gonna get gathered down all the way into the bodice, just like this right here, all of the gathers. And so we're gonna sew basting stitches from the center back to the side seam, and then we're gonna stop there. Then we're gonna sew basting stitches from the side seam all the way to the other side seam and stop there, and do it again from side seam to the other center back. We're gonna sew 2 rows of basting stitches right next to each other all the way around the waistline. One will be at 1/4 of an inch and the other will be at 1/8 of an inch. When you're sewing basting stitches, it's just a straight stitch with an extra long stitch length. I recommend using whatever the longest stitch length is on your sewing machine. Now with right sides facing each other, we're going to pin the top edge of the outer bodice, not the lining, but the outer bodice, to the top edge of the skirt. Then we're going to pin a few key points together. For me, that's going to be the side seams of the skirt with the side seams of the bodice, the center back of the skirt with the center back of the bodice, and then I also like to quarter the pieces that are in between, just to help further ensure that my gathers are nice and even all the way around the dress. When I do the quartering, it's not super precise, but it really doesn't have to be. I'm just trying to get a general idea of how much fabric goes into each section. Also, I'm really sorry that I didn't get the full view on the camera. I didn't realize that my hands were kind of out of the view. To help with that, I've added a few illustrations on screen that will hopefully give you a good idea of what I'm doing, even if you can't quite see it. Now after pinning those key points, it's time to start gathering the skirt into the bodice. Take the bobbin thread of each basting stitch and start gently pulling it and moving the gathers. Once everything feels nice and even, you can pin the fabric in place. This can take quite a bit of time because you're gathering so much fabric down into the bodice. So be patient with yourself through this process, and when you finally finish, we are going to take our work over to our sewing machine and sew the skirt to the bodice with a 3/8 inch or a 1 centimeter seam allowance. After sewing the skirt down, you're welcome to take out the basting stitches. However, they were designed to be hidden inside of the seam allowance, so I don't really think it's necessary, and I never do that. Basting stitches are generally designed as placeholders that you take out after you're done using them, but our next step is to finish those edges together, and like I said, all of this is going to be hidden inside of the bodice, so to me, taking out those basting stitches is just an added and unnecessary step. Alright, now all of that to say that it's time to finish those edges together. You can use a serger or a zigzag stitch for this step. Just please be careful as you're doing this step, especially if you're using a serger with a knife like I am. It's so easy to accidentally mismanage the fabric because there's just so much of it at this point, and then accidentally cut into or sew over a section that you didn't intend to. I've definitely been the one to put holes in a nearly finished garment. I actually did it when I was filming the tapioca trouser tutorial, and I still wear them because I patched the hole, but it was just such a needless bummer. And of course, I always want to save you from those mistakes if it's possible, so please, please, please be as careful as you can. Alright, next up, it is time to press that entire finished edge up into the bodice. Like we just talked about, there's a lot of fabric to manage, so I like to press from the back side first, and then flip it over and press from the front side to ensure that all of the gathers look really nice. Pressing the seam allowance up into the bodice is going to leave a really nice crisp edge on that waistline, and it's also going to encourage the skirt to fall how we want it to. Alright, would you look at that? Our dress is finally, officially starting to look like a dress. Next up, we are going to insert the invisible zipper. With the low heat setting, we are going to iron open the invisible zipper teeth on both sides. This is going to make it a lot easier when we get to the sewing section, because if you don't iron open the teeth, it can make it so that the invisible zipper isn't actually invisible, because it's really hard to get close enough to the teeth with your sewing machine if the teeth aren't ironed flat. Now go ahead and take your dress and open it up so that the lining is out of the way. Then grab your invisible zipper and line up the beginning of the zipper teeth just below the seam where the bodice and the outer lining attach. You'll notice that the zipper tape extends onto the lining side, but that's totally okay. We're going to snip it off in a later step, so don't worry about it. You're going to pin all the way from the top of the zipper teeth down to the bottom of the zipper. When you pin that top bit, I recommend moving the seam allowance out of the way so that it doesn't get caught in the stitching. Now we're going to sew the zipper in place, and when we do this, we want to get as close to the zipper teeth as possible without actually puncturing through them. There are two secrets to doing this. One is to use an invisible zipper foot, and the other is the step that we already did, which was pressing the zipper teeth open. Now you're going to sew from the top of the zipper teeth all the way down to the bottom of the zipper. The goal is to stitch on top of the visible line that's left over from where the zipper teeth was creased before you pressed it open. When you get to the seam where the bodice and the skirt attach, pause for a second to ensure that the seam allowance is still pushed up into the bodice. Then when you get to the bottom of the zipper, sew as close as you can to the zipper pull without making any of your seams wobbly. Next up, we're going to sew the other side of the zipper to the other side of the dress. To make sure that everything lines up properly, I recommend pulling the zipper up to the top and then taking a pin and pinning right at that waistline seam. That way, once you open the zipper, you can line up the pin with the waistline seam on the other side, and then once you sew it all together and zip it back up, the waistline seam is going to look perfect and beautiful on the back side of the garment. Now just keep pinning until we get to the bottom of the zipper, and then we are going to sew it in place. There's kind of a lot of fabric and dress to manage at this point underneath the machine, so just go slow if you're having a hard time. Let's go ahead and zip up that zipper to ensure that everything is functioning properly, and huge congratulations if it is. Invisible zippers can be a little bit tricky. Next up, we are going to snip off that excess zipper fabric that's just above the zipper teeth. I like to put my scissors right in line with the seam where the outer bodice and the lining meet, and then snip right there. After that, we are going to sew together the bottom of the skirt to the top of the zipper. Sew with right sides together, line up the skirt at the bottom, and then pin it all the way until you get to the zipper stop. Then we are going to sew it together with a 3/8 inch or a 1 centimeter seam allowance. You're going to want to sew as close as you can to the zipper pull. Don't worry if you end up with a tiny gap here, because the zipper pull gets in the way of the presser foot. The small gap between stitches isn't going to be an issue, and it's also not going to be visible when the garment is worn. After that, we are going to press the seam allowance open so that that center back seam is nice and crispy. So in order to sew the lining down, we're going to first want to hem the bottom edge of the lining. To do this, let's start by finishing the entire bottom edge of the lining with either a serger or a zigzag stitch. Then we're going to press that finish edge under by 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Go ahead and do this all the way around that finished edge, and then we are going to take it over to our sewing machine and we are going to edge stitch it in place. Now we're going to encapsulate the zipper between the bodice lining and the outer bodice. So with right sides together, you're going to fold the bodice lining over the outer bodice and pin it in place. Go ahead and do this to both sides, and then we are going to sew these sections down. But when we do this, we need to make sure that we do not sew through the zipper teeth. So my preference is to pin this all together and then actually sew from the opposite side so you can see those original stitches, and then you're just going to stitch right on top of them. That way you will know for sure that you are not going to sew through the zipper teeth. We're getting so close and I'm so excited. Go ahead and turn your garment right sides out. You can grab the end of that zipper and just tug on it, and it should come out really, really nicely. After you've done that, we're going to zip the zipper all the way up to the top, and then we are going to bring the garment over to our ironing station and iron the zipper in place. Doing this is not only going to make the garment look nice, but it's also going to make it a lot easier to zip and unzip the zipper. The next step is to tack down the lining to the bodice. To do this, we are going to pin the bodice lining to the bodice outer on all of the vertical seams. Do your best to line them up nicely, because if you don't, it's going to be visible from the outside of the garment when the lining is bunching against your body. Okay, so now from the right side of the garment, we are going to sew a small straight stitch at every single one of those seams. To ensure that it's invisible, we are going to stitch in the ditch. The goal of stitching in the ditch is for the stitching to be invisible from the right side of the garment, but tack down the lining on the inside of the garment. After that, we are nearly done with this dress. All we have to do is hem the skirt and then finish the straps. To hem the skirt, we are going to start by pressing the raw edge under by 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. You're going to want to do this all the way around the very long skirt, and then we are going to fold it up again another 3/8 of an inch so that the raw edge is completely enclosed. Now we're going to take our work over to our sewing machine and edge stitch the skirt in place all the way around. When the hem is done, you can finish the straps by going to the timestamp on the screen and following along with how I finish the straps on the top. Congratulations on officially finishing either your sparkle top or your sparkle dress. This pattern was truly a labor of love, with many months going into fitting and adjusting and getting everything just right. We couldn't have done it without all our 42 amazing testers, so I wanted to give them a massive shout out for being just the best and so helpful. Now I hope you absolutely love your new garment and that it gets lots of wear for many years to come. Thanks for being here, and I will see you in the next one.